I should have known better than to expect anything different. The moment I walked into Romano's Italian restaurant that evening, I could feel the familiar weight of invisibility settling over my shoulders like an old, worn coat. My family was already gathered around the large corner table, their voices creating that particular buzz of excitement that always seemed to dim the moment I appeared. Aunt Margaret looked up from her animated conversation with my cousin Sarah, her eyes scanning me from head to toe with that practiced disapproval she'd perfected over the years. "Oh, Hannah," she said, her voice carrying just enough sweetness to fool strangers, but not enough to fool me. "You made it. How nice." The restaurant was bustling with the dinner crowd, families celebrating birthdays, and couples sharing intimate conversations over candlelight. The aroma of garlic bread and marinara sauce filled the air, mixing with the sound of clinking glasses and gentle laughter from nearby tables. I took my usual spot at the far end of the table, the chair that always seemed to be positioned just slightly outside the circle of warmth. My Uncle Frank was deep in conversation with Kyle, my cousin's husband, about some business deal that was apparently going to change everything for them. Sarah was showing off photos of her latest vacation to Italy, the one she'd posted about endlessly on social media for weeks. Everyone was so absorbed in their own little worlds that my arrival barely registered as more than a minor interruption. As I settled into my chair, I couldn't help but notice how the table had been set. There were 8 place settings, but somehow mine looked different. The silverware was mismatched, the napkin was paper instead of cloth, and my water glass had a small chip on the rim. It was subtle, the kind of thing that could be explained away as an accident or oversight. But I knew better. These small slights had been accumulating for years, each one carefully designed to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. I was 32 years old, unmarried, childless, and apparently worthless in the eyes of the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The weight of their judgment pressed down on me like a physical force, making it hard to breathe. Margaret's voice cut through my thoughts like a knife through butter. "Now, before we order, I want everyone to know that we're celebrating tonight. Kyle just got that promotion we've all been hoping for, and Sarah is finally pregnant with their second child." The table erupted in congratulations and excited chatter, glasses clinking together in celebration. I forced a smile and raised my chipped water glass, murmuring appropriate words of congratulations that were immediately swallowed by the noise. Nobody asked about my life, my work, or anything that might be happening in my world. I was just the audience, the witness to their happiness, the person who filled an empty chair so the table wouldn't look too sparse. The waiter approached our table with practiced efficiency, his notepad ready and his smile genuine. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with kind eyes that seemed to actually see me when he looked in my direction. "Good evening, folks. Can I start you off with some appetizers tonight?" Margaret immediately took charge, as she always did, ordering enough food to feed a small army. Calamari, bruschetta, antipasto platters, and garlic bread. She rattled off the list like she was planning a feast for royalty. The waiter scribbled everything down, occasionally glancing around the table to make sure he had everyone's attention. When his eyes met mine, I saw something there that I hadn't seen in a long time. Recognition, respect, maybe even a hint of conspiracy. As the conversation flowed around me, I found myself studying the faces of my family members. These were people I'd known my entire life, people who'd been present at every birthday, every holiday, every major milestone. Yet somehow, I felt like a stranger among them. Margaret was holding court at the head of the table, her perfectly styled hair catching the restaurant's warm lighting as she gestured dramatically while telling some story about her latest charity committee meeting. Sarah was glowing with that particular radiance that pregnant women seem to possess, her hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach, while Kyle beamed with pride beside her. Uncle Frank was checking his phone intermittently, probably monitoring some stock prices or business emails, even during family time. The appetizers arrived in a parade of steaming plates and aromatic dishes. Margaret immediately began directing traffic, telling everyone what to try and how much to take. "Now, don't be greedy," she said with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We want to make sure there's enough for everyone." But as the plates were passed around the table, I noticed a familiar pattern emerging. Sarah got the first choice of everything, followed by Kyle, then Uncle Frank, then Margaret herself. The plates made their way around the table in a carefully orchestrated dance of family hierarchy, and by the time they reached me, The best pieces were gone. I was left with the smallest calamari rings, the burnt edges of the bruschetta, and the wilted lettuce from the antipasto platter. I picked at my meager portion, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. This was my life, this was my family, and this was apparently all I deserved. But as I sat there, listening to their laughter and watching their joy, I couldn't help but smile to myself. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea that the woman they treated like an afterthought, like a charity case, like someone who should be grateful just to be included, had already taken care of everything. The secret I was carrying felt like a warm coal in my chest, growing hotter with each passing moment. Soon, very soon, they would understand exactly who they'd been underestimating all these years. The main course ordering process was a masterclass in family dynamics that I'd witnessed countless times before. Margaret took charge again, her voice rising above the general chatter as she made executive decisions about what everyone should eat. "Sarah, honey, you should get the salmon. It's good for the baby. Kyle, you love their ribeye, don't you? Frank, the chicken marsala is excellent here." She went around the table like a general deploying troops, assigning meals based on her perception of what each person deserved or needed. When she finally turned to me, almost as an afterthought, her tone shifted to something that sounded dangerously close to pity. "And Hannah, maybe you'd like the soup and salad? It's lighter and probably more appropriate for your budget." The words hit me like a slap across the face, but I kept my expression neutral. The assumption that I couldn't afford a proper meal stung more than I cared to admit, especially considering the irony of the situation. I could have ordered the most expensive item on the menu. Hell, I could have ordered 3 of them. But instead, I simply nodded and asked for the chicken piccata. The waiter wrote down my order with the same attention he'd given everyone else, but I caught him glancing at me with what looked like curiosity. There was something in his expression that made me wonder if he knew more than he was letting on. The thought sent a little thrill through me, adding another layer to the anticipation that was building in my chest. As we waited for our meals, the conversation naturally drifted to the usual topics that dominated family gatherings. Margaret launched into a detailed account of her latest home renovation project, complete with complaints about contractors and designers who apparently didn't understand her vision. Sarah chimed in with stories about her toddler's latest achievements, each milestone presented as if her child was the first in human history to accomplish such feats. Kyle discussed his promotion with the kind of swagger that suggested he believed his success was entirely due to his own brilliance, rather than the connections his father-in-law had provided. Uncle Frank nodded along to everything, occasionally grunting his approval or offering sage advice that nobody had asked for. I found myself retreating into my own thoughts, a survival mechanism I'd developed over years of family gatherings. In my mind, I was back in my office 3 days ago, sitting across from my financial advisor as we discussed the final details of my latest investment portfolio. The numbers on the screen had been staggering, even to me. Years of careful saving, smart investments, and a successful freelance consulting business had paid off in ways that would have shocked my family if they'd bothered to ask about my life. But they never asked, never showed interest in what I did for work or how I spent my time. To them, I was just poor, pitiful Hannah who couldn't catch a husband and therefore must be struggling to make ends meet. The irony was almost too delicious to bear. While they were all leveraged to the hilt with mortgages, car payments, and credit card debt, I owned my home outright and had enough money in the bank to retire comfortably if I wanted to. My consulting work with tech startups had proven incredibly lucrative, and my investment in cryptocurrency early on had paid dividends that even I hadn't expected. But I'd learned long ago that sharing good news with this family was pointless. They either didn't believe it, found ways to diminish it, or somehow made it about themselves. So I'd stopped trying, stopped sharing, stopped expecting anything from them except exactly what they were giving me now. Indifference mixed with condescension. The meals arrived in a symphony of sizzling plates and aromatic steam. The waiter and his team moved with practiced efficiency, setting down each dish with a flourish that made everything look like it belonged in a food magazine. Margaret's lobster tail gleamed under the restaurant's lighting. Sarah's salmon was perfectly grilled with artistic vegetable arrangements, and Kyle's ribeye was thick enough to feed 2 people. Uncle Frank's chicken marsala came with a side of pasta that could have been a meal in itself. My chicken piccata looked modest by comparison, but it smelled incredible and was beautifully presented with lemon slices and fresh herbs that made my mouth water. But before anyone could take a bite, Margaret raised her hand like a traffic cop, stopping oncoming cars. "Wait, wait," she said, her voice carrying that tone of authority she'd perfected over decades of family management. "Before we start eating, I think we should take a moment to appreciate what we have here. This is a special night, and I want everyone to remember it." She looked around the table with the satisfaction of someone who believed she was orchestrating a perfect family moment. Then her eyes landed on me, and her expression shifted to something that might have been mistaken for kindness if you didn't know her better. "Hannah, dear, since you're not really contributing to the celebration tonight, why don't you wait until everyone else has finished eating? It's only polite, don't you think?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, acrid and suffocating. Around the table, I could see the various reactions playing out on my family members' faces. Sarah looked uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. Kyle seemed oblivious, already cutting into his steak with enthusiasm. Uncle Frank was studying his phone again, either missing the moment entirely or choosing to ignore it. The waiter, who had been refilling water glasses nearby, froze mid-pour, his eyes widening slightly as he processed what he'd just heard. For a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving just me and Margaret locked in a silent battle of wills that had been building for years. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but my voice was steady when I finally spoke. "Okay," I said simply, setting down my fork and folding my hands in my lap. "I'll wait." The next 20 minutes felt like an eternity, stretched thin, each second crawling by with the weight of humiliation and anticipation. I sat perfectly still, watching my family devour their meals with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from knowing you're eating on someone else's dime, or so they thought. Margaret made a show of savoring every bite of her lobster, occasionally making little sounds of pleasure that seemed designed to remind me of what I was missing. Sarah and Kyle were lost in their own world of marital bliss and pregnancy hormones, feeding each other bites of their respective dishes like they were still newlyweds, instead of a couple who'd been together for 8 years. Uncle Frank methodically worked his way through his chicken marsala, pausing only to check his phone or grunt his approval at particularly good bites. The smell of my cooling chicken piccata was torture, but I endured it with the kind of grace that comes from years of practice. Other diners occasionally glanced our way, probably wondering why one person at our table wasn't eating while everyone else was clearly enjoying their meals. I could see the confusion in their eyes, the way they tried to piece together the social dynamics they were witnessing. A few tables over, an elderly couple kept looking in our direction with expressions that ranged from curiosity to what looked like disapproval. The woman whispered something to her husband, who shook his head sadly. Even strangers could see that something wasn't right about this picture, but my own family was either oblivious or simply didn't care. The waiter, whose name tag read Marcus, had been hovering nearby more than usual, refilling water glasses that didn't need refilling and adjusting table settings that were already perfect. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I finally looked up, he gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. There was something in his expression that made my pulse quicken, a look of understanding, maybe even conspiracy. He knew something. I was certain of it now. The way he'd been treating me all evening, the extra attention, the respectful tone, it all made sense now. My secret was about to become very public, and Marcus was going to be the one to deliver it. The thought sent a thrill of anticipation through me that was almost strong enough to overcome the humiliation of sitting there like a scolded child. Margaret was holding court again, regaling the table with stories about her latest charity committee meeting while she picked at the last bits of her lobster. "You know, it's so important to give back to the community," she was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of self-righteousness that made my teeth ache. "Some people just don't understand the responsibility that comes with being blessed. They think only about themselves, never considering how they might help others who are less fortunate." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me, considering she was currently making her own niece wait to eat like some kind of family servant. But I bit my tongue and continued to wait, knowing that my moment was coming soon. Sarah finally pushed her plate away with a satisfied sigh, her hand resting on her stomach in that protective gesture that pregnant women seem to develop instinctively. "That was incredible," she said, beaming at Kyle, who was still working on his massive ribeye. "We should definitely come here more often. It's so nice when we can all get together like this." She glanced in my direction, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes. But it passed quickly, replaced by the comfortable self-absorption that seemed to run in our family like a genetic trait. Kyle nodded enthusiastically, his mouth full of steak, completely oblivious to the undercurrents of tension that had been building all evening. Uncle Frank was the next to finish, pushing his empty plate away and immediately reaching for his phone to check whatever urgent business matter couldn't wait until after dinner. Margaret was taking her time, clearly savoring not just her food, but also the power dynamic she'd established. She would take a small bite, chew slowly, and then launch into another story or observation, drawing out the meal as long as possible. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, and I had to admire her technique even as I despised her for using it. But with each passing minute, my anticipation grew stronger. Soon, very soon, the tables would turn in a way that none of them could possibly anticipate. Kyle finally finished his steak and leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just conquered a particularly challenging meal. "That was fantastic," he announced to the table, as if his opinion carried special weight because of his recent promotion. "We should definitely make this a regular thing, maybe once a month or so?" Margaret nodded approvingly, already planning future gatherings where she could continue to orchestrate these little displays of family hierarchy. Sarah was scrolling through her phone, probably posting photos of her meal to social media with captions about family time and gratitude. Uncle Frank was deep in an email, his fingers flying across his phone screen as he conducted business during what was supposed to be family time. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 25 minutes, Margaret set down her fork with theatrical finality. "Well," she announced, looking around the table with the satisfaction of a queen surveying her kingdom, "I think we're all finished now. Hannah, dear, you can eat now." Her tone was magnanimous, as if she was granting me some great favor rather than allowing me to eat the meal I'd been staring at for the better part of half an hour. I picked up my fork with steady hands, even though my heart was racing with anticipation. The chicken was lukewarm now, but I took a bite anyway, savoring not just the taste, but the knowledge that this would be the last time Margaret would ever have the opportunity to humiliate me like this. Because in just a few minutes, everything was going to change. I was halfway through my lukewarm chicken piccata when Marcus appeared at our table with a leather folder in his hands and an expression that was carefully neutral, but somehow charged with electricity. The entire table fell silent as he approached, that kind of sudden quiet that happens when everyone senses that something significant is about to occur. Margaret looked up from her phone with mild irritation, probably annoyed that her post-meal social media session was being interrupted. Sarah and Kyle were still lost in their own bubble of contentment, but even they seemed to pick up on the shift in atmosphere. Uncle Frank actually looked up from his business emails, which was remarkable in itself since I'd rarely seen anything pull his attention away from his phone during family gatherings. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice carrying a professional courtesy that somehow felt more respectful than anything I'd heard from my own family all evening. "I have the receipt for tonight's dinner." He held up the leather folder, and I could see Margaret's eyes light up with the kind of predatory gleam that appeared whenever she was about to make someone else pay for her generosity. This was always her favorite part of family dinners, the moment when she could graciously allow someone else to pick up the tab while making it seem like she was doing them a favor. Usually it was Uncle Frank who got stuck with the bill, though sometimes she'd guilt-trip one of her children into paying as a way of showing appreciation for family. But instead of approaching Margaret or Uncle Frank, Marcus walked directly to my side of the table. The leather folder landed in front of me with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the sudden silence like a gunshot. Every eye at the table was now focused on me, and I could feel the weight of their collective confusion pressing down like a physical force. Margaret's mouth had fallen open slightly, her perfectly applied lipstick creating a small O of surprise. Sarah looked genuinely puzzled, her head tilted to one side like a confused puppy. Kyle had stopped mid-chew, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Even Uncle Frank had set down his phone, his business emails forgotten in the face of this unexpected development. "Thank you for dining with us tonight, Ms. Rodriguez," Marcus said, his voice carrying a warmth and respect that made my chest swell with something I hadn't felt in years. "Everything has been taken care of, as requested. The full payment was processed 3 days ago, including the 25% gratuity you specified for the service staff. His words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread across every face at the table. I could see the exact moment when understanding began to dawn on each of them, the way their expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief to something that looked almost like fear. Margaret was the first to find her voice, though it came out as more of a croak than her usual commanding tone. "I'm sorry, there must be some mistake," she said, her eyes darting between Marcus and me like she was watching a tennis match. "Hannah couldn't possibly have… she doesn't have the means to…" Her voice trailed off as the implications of what she was saying began to sink in. For the first time in my memory, Margaret was speechless, her usual arsenal of cutting remarks and condescending observations completely depleted in the face of this revelation. The woman who had spent the entire evening treating me like a charity case was suddenly confronted with the reality that I had been the one providing the charity all along. I opened the leather folder with deliberate slowness, savoring every second of the moment I'd been anticipating for 3 days. The receipt was printed on heavy paper with the restaurant's elegant letterhead, and the numbers at the bottom were impressive enough to make even Uncle Frank's business-focused mind take notice. $847 for the meal, plus a $212 tip that brought the total to over $1,000. It was more money than most people spent on a week's worth of groceries, paid in full by the woman they'd been treating like she should be grateful for table scraps. I looked up from the receipt to find 7 pairs of eyes staring at me, with expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment to what might have been the beginning of respect. Sarah was the first to break the stunned silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hannah, I don't understand. How did you…" She couldn't finish the question, probably because she was beginning to realize how little she actually knew about my life, my work, or my financial situation. Kyle looked like he'd been hit by a truck, his promotion celebration suddenly seeming small and insignificant in comparison to this revelation. Uncle Frank was staring at the receipt with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for stock reports, probably calculating exactly how much money I'd just spent on a family that had treated me like an afterthought. But it was Margaret's reaction that I found most satisfying, the way her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, the way her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. I folded the receipt carefully and placed it back in the leather folder, then looked around the table at the faces of my family members. These were people who had known me my entire life, yet they had never bothered to really see me, never bothered to ask about my successes or my struggles, never bothered to treat me with the basic respect that every human being deserves. For years, I had endured their condescension and their pity, their assumptions about my life and their casual cruelty disguised as family tradition. But tonight, in this moment, with a simple piece of paper and a $1,000 gesture, I had shattered every assumption they'd ever made about me. The invisible woman had suddenly become very visible indeed, and the silence that followed was more powerful than any words I could have spoken. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the gentle clinking of dishes and distant conversations from other tables. I could see my family members struggling to process what had just happened, their minds working overtime to reconcile the Hannah they thought they knew with the woman who had just revealed herself to be their financial superior. Margaret's face had gone through several shades of red and was now settling into a pale, sickly color that made her expensive makeup look garish under the restaurant's warm lighting. Sarah kept opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water, while Kyle had abandoned all pretense of eating and was staring at me with the kind of wonder usually reserved for natural disasters or lottery winners. Uncle Frank, ever the businessman, was the first to recover his composure, though I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes as he recalculated everything he thought he knew about his niece's financial situation. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and steady, carrying none of the hurt or anger that had been building inside me for years. "I've been paying for these family dinners for the past 6 months," I said, letting the words sink in before continuing. "Not just here, but at every restaurant we've been to since Christmas. The steakhouse where we celebrated Kyle's birthday, the seafood place for Sarah's pregnancy announcement, even that expensive French restaurant where we had Uncle Frank's retirement party." I paused, watching their faces as the full scope of my generosity became clear. I called ahead each time, paid in full, and asked them to keep it quiet. I wanted you all to enjoy yourselves without worrying about money, because despite everything, you're still my family. The irony of my words wasn't lost on any of us. I had been taking care of them financially while they treated me like I needed their charity emotionally. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Hannah, we had no idea. Why didn't you tell us? But even as she asked the question, I could see in her eyes that she already knew the answer. How could I have told them when they never asked about my life, never showed interest in my work, never treated me as anything more than a burden to be tolerated? I stood up slowly, placing my napkin on the table with deliberate care, and looked around at each of their faces one last time. Because, I said simply, you never asked. I picked up my purse and walked toward the exit, leaving behind not just the restaurant, but years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. As I reached the door, I heard Marcus call out behind me. Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. We hope to see you again soon. I smiled and nodded, knowing that when I did return, it would be on my own terms, with people who valued me for who I truly was, rather than who they assumed me to be.